Okay. Welcome to Assessment and Reading Instruction, EMR 503. My name is Beth Walsh-Morman, and I will be your instructor for this course. And this is the lecture for week 1. Before I continue with my discussion, I want to make sure that you have completed the first task of the course. If you've not already completed your personal inventory paper, please just stop the recording right now. It's purposely sequenced in this way so that you are able to kind of go through your own thoughts before you are confronted with other people's thinking on the topic of assessment and reading. So if you could just stop this recording and move on. For those of you that have completed that, we're going to begin to address the course objectives. We're going to get ourselves on the same page today. If you look at the course syllabus, which I hope you've already looked at on Leo, you'll see that the really important course objectives are that we're going to learn a wide range of assessment tools and practices that provide measurement data for individuals and groups. It's a really big objective, and obviously those assessments and practices are going to really vary depending on the education settings and situations that we're in. However, there definitely are some fundamental common understandings that I want to make sure that kind of drive our conversations in this course. So, today's focus then of this brief lesson will be to offer a historical perspective on reading research, to introduce key terms and ideas for the semester, and then just to go over what's due this week, just in case there's any questions. You can also always email me if you have any questions. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at a historical perspective. When we think of reading assessments, I think we all have certain tools that we think of right away. Certainly, those of us that are in content area classes are thinking of the AIR tests and the PARCC tests that preceded them, and all those proficiency tests that are so important and have become such a part and staple of the education world. Many of us have experienced doing a informal reading inventory. Some of us have given students DIBELS testing to measure fluency. So there's a lot of things that come to mind. And the question that really should be guiding us in this part of the class is really a question of history. How have we gotten to where we are? And when you think about those items that we consider when we consider a reading assessment, why is it that those items are kind of the staples in today's reading assessments? All right, I don't hesitate to use John Dewey for just about anything. He's probably one of my personal education favorites. But really, our story of reading assessment begins in the 20th century, when progressives began to call for student growth models of education. Prior to that, education really was merely thought to achieve two things: prepare people for participation in organized religion, and prepare people for participation in social and/or political life. Therefore, prior to the progressives, reading was really largely seen as a skill that had value in its usefulness. Recitation and copying were used to develop very limited skills. It didn't take a lot of literary skills to be able to be functionally literate in that society. Think of this. In colonial America, a citizen really would largely only need to be able to read the Bible and sign legal papers, perhaps a deed. Beyond that, reading was really seen as a luxury, something for the upper class. As our society advanced, however, the literacy demands, the reading demands, those increased. When we moved into the end of the 18th and into the 19th century, we were really kind of coalescing as a society. Immigration, we were a nation of immigrants, and so school was really there to assimilate American society and to give learners these functional skills that they can use through that society. So when we think about schooling, prior to John Dewey's era and the progressive era, we really don't have a lot of idea of cognition or independent thinking. John Dewey and others began to envision a school system that was designed to foster independent, student-centered thinking. This had large implications on reading pedagogy because reading was no longer seen as a passive act, but as one that is supposed to engage the learner in independent thought. Developmentalists such as G. Stanley Hall or Arnold Grell, you may have heard of those in some of your education classes, in psychology classes, they really started to look at patterns of growth for children. And they discovered that children at various stages of development adapt to various methods of coping with the world around them. So we have things like, when we think about Piaget and students being able to grasp concrete versus abstract ideas and things like that, object permanence. So, moreover, developmentalists began to see reading as a set of interrelated skills that you had the same skills, you just use those skills a little bit differently depending on your task or depending on what you were reading. This is where we saw the entrance of leveled reading programs that approach reading as a recursive skill, a skill that students kept going back to. And graded programs, while these kind of graded programs existed prior to the 20th century, it was really the developmentalists who shifted expectations for the reader based on developmental stages rather than approaching it as kind of a uniform skill that everyone does at this and that we use at the same time. So we began to really look at, in the 20th century, distinct research into reading was largely completed by psychologists and psychiatrists, not by educators. Researchers became deeply interested in the process of reading. Studies of eye movement dominated the field for quite a while, but what emerged was a growing understanding of reading as a process. This marks the emergence of an understanding that thinking is vitally linked to reading, an idea that's credited to Edmund Burke Huey and his work, The Psychology and Pedagogy of Reading, which was published in 1908. While much of his work has been discredited, his focus on thinking helped to shape later cognitive theories of reading and really kind of shapes us even today. Well, reading assessments really, written tests, the idea of having students write tests, those really was something that began in our public school system. Horace Mann introduced it in 1845. But standardized tests are what we begin to think of today as standardized tests. Those really didn't emerge until the 20th century. That's because in 1905, Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon created the first standardized test, a 20-item IQ test that was used in France to identify students that they thought were unable to be successful in school. By 1914, the American version of Binet's test was published. At about that same time, Edward Thorndike was developing standardized achievement tests in arithmetic, in handwriting, in spelling, in drawing, of all things, in reading, and in language. These tests often included written responses and were very tedious to administer and to grade. So while standardized, and they did have standard rules for administration and all of that, they weren't the standardized tests like the pencil, and paper tests that we think of today. It really was the beginning of World War I, when the U.S. military needed to find a way to efficiently assess 2 million recruits so that they can sort them by their ability and get them placed into their right roles in the military, that we began to see our traditional standardized test. It was at this time that this idea of multiple choice answers, which was being used on a state-to-state scale, was used on a large scale for a national purpose. It was difficult to tell the difference, however, between reading comprehension assessments and these intelligence tests, because obviously these intelligence tests really relied very, very strongly on on reading ability. So for instance, what I've put up on the screen right now is an item from an undated, but probably somewhere around the 1920s intelligence test that was developed by Louis Luan Thurstone, which was distributed in the United States. And as you can see, it really is very difficult to distinguish this from what we would consider a reading assessment. So at this time, we began to get some understanding, some normative understandings of what was needed for comprehension to occur and for a student to be able to comprehend. So researchers really began to focus in on recall. A lot of reading assessments would ask students to recall relevant words or ideas after conducting a silent reading task themselves. Another thing that was really sort of believed to be very important was this idea of time testing. And so there was a lot of emphasis on the speed with which tasks were conducted by students, because there was a belief that that was very tied into their comprehension skills. The emphasis then on meaning making within the act of reading really established reading to learn pedagogy practices that became the foundation for later content reading pedagogy. So this idea that that when you read, you are demonstrating that you can learn, but you are also learning from what you read. So this kind of back and forth relationship between the text and the student was something that we came to really appreciate in the 20th century. Cyrus Mead found silent reading superior to earlier reading as early as 1915 because he believed that reading lends itself to getting the thought for which the writer wishes to express. So he really believed that the reflective practice of reading had value. Edward L. Thorndike was the one who disputed notions of reading as a simple habit, began to look at the different elements of reading. He began to say that, reading is a matter of many things coming together, coalescing together: the structure and the readability of the text, the content, and the reader mindset. So he began to look at the complexities of reading by 1917 and very much a way that has informed us. He's the one that said that the reader is asked to accept and reject connotation while reading and attempt to determine a final response to the reading. So he really began to see this as not as just simply taking an idea from the writer, but that the reader actually has a role in constructing or understanding this meaning. Studies in the earliest 20th century began to attempt to determine the relationship between content area achievement and reading, and early studies really began to show that students, not surprisingly, students that could read well also tended to achieve more in the content area. So they tended to perform better even in what we would consider non-reading content areas like math, but certainly science and history. Thus, even as we came to understand what goes into the act of reading, we were also becoming to see it as an important way not only for students to demonstrate their learning, but also for them to learn new information. It was the 1930s and 1940 technological advances that really began to sort of bring on or foster on the type of standardized testing that we often think of today. IBM invented the scanners, which dramatically reduced the cost of scoring standardized tests. Up until this point, SATs were written tests with short answers, but now machine scoreable multiple choice tests were largely seen as very useful and very efficient. So we started to see a lot of new generation reading tests that were created in this pencil and paper format, with test makers focusing largely on two key skills that we believed at that point to be very critical to comprehension: word knowledge or vocabulary acquisition, and verbal reasoning. What emerged is a statistical analysis approach to reading assessment, where we began to see, and in that we began to see that some skills, the subscores, so many of the tests would like look at it. They would have an overall reasoning score, but then they would look at like sub scores, what kind of sub skills, what kind of skills were needed. And by 1971, we were beginning to understand that some skills really we could look at as being statistically independent. Listening comprehension might be higher or lower than verbal reasoning, and reading and skimming speed might be slow, but the student might have high ability in verbal reasoning. But we began to see that there were some skills that really we couldn't look at independent of the overall reading score. So they must have been, they were too infused in the reading comprehension to be able to be measured separately. And those were things like paragraph meaning, being able to understand cause and effect, being able to draw inferences, being able to select main ideas. So at this point we were beginning to understand that some of our sub-skills in reading are discrete, but most are kind of integrated into a process that is codependent on each other. I want to interject that it was really at this point, and partly because of some concerns about the standardized testing, that one type of assessment that's still widely used today, the closed testing, that was developed in the 1950s. Wilson Taylor really developed it as an alternative to conventional standardized tests, because he was hoping that this would eliminate what he perceived as subjectiveness in the test. Even the types of questions that would be asked with the passage, he saw that as really subjective. So what happens with a closed, for those of you that are unfamiliar with a closed reading test, is that a test designer simply deletes every so many words. Usually it's about every fifth word in a passage. And then the examinee is asked to fill in each closed blank. So since the introduction of this testing method, researchers have debated significant scoring questions. It really hasn't, it's been somewhat problematic in its use because, for instance, if students were to say put a synonym for a word instead of the word that was in the passage originally, is that supposed to be considered as incorrect? Or some people have argued that maybe it's really only the content words that should be deleted from the passage, and that the every fifth word, it really introduces a randomness that isn't useful for reading assessment. As cognitive theories of education took root in the 1950s, important questions really started to emerge. For instance, reading educators began to understand the notion of background knowledge. This begged the question: could students simply use their background knowledge and not their reading comprehension to answer some questions? So are all of our questions necessarily text dependent? Others began to look at cultural bias and the impact on assessment data, especially in light of achievement gaps between white and minority students. So if, for instance, a test was largely reflective of, say, suburban life, would that create some kind of an impediment for a student that's growing up in a urban or a very rural setting? So by the late 1980s, constructivist approaches to reading assessments really began to emerge. These reformers sought new formats and new and appropriate types of questions for assessments. So the assessments that were emerging in the 1980s started to address questions of prior knowledge, environmental clues, the text itself, and the students as meaning makers. What emerged were assessments with longer passages, more challenging questions, different question formats, such as the more than one correct answer, check all the ones that apply, those types of formats. Some reforms were not even visible to the teachers themselves. It was in the 1980s that we began to see testing companies really develop elaborate processes in test development in the hopes of being able to address any perceived deficits in the testing that they were designing. As part of this constructivist pursuit, we saw the introduction of some types of reading assessments that you might still see today. Sentence verification task comprehension was developed in the 1970s, and it was developed in an effort to better test comprehension from a cognitive and constructivist view of reading. So in a sentence verification task, the examinee is given a sentence and asked to select an appropriate paraphrase from a group of possible answers. Each group of possible answers, each bank of possible answers, included an appropriate paraphrase of the sentence with some semantic substitutes. And then the others, there was one that would change the meaning but would keep the words, and there was another one that would be completely different in its meaning and its word use both. Importantly, it was in the 1970s and 80s that we began to look at classroom-based assessments as more critical and more informative than I think we had looked at them in the past. Retellings became really an important tool for assessing comprehension, and checklists and protocols were developed for teachers to be able to really look at retellings and really analyze what types of miscues students might be making. Researchers began to practice think aloud protocols that would allow them to kind of ask the students to share and engage in their thought process. Variations would have students do things like take mandatory notes where they had to explain what they were thinking about a passage at this point in the passage. Also, fluency testing and informal reading inventories were refined. It became a part of the reading assessments that were used early and often so that we could identify struggling readers. Okay, so that's a little bit of the history and how we got to the place that we are today. Next week, we're going to look a little bit more carefully at the Common Core and its influence on reading assessments. But for the rest of this lesson, I just want to get us some vocabulary so that when we're talking about assessments, we have a common vocabulary that we're talking about. All right. So really, everything in this course, we're going to be looking at a contextual model because that's really the most important and guiding model for reading assessments that we have today. While a deficit model is really predicated on the idea that difficulty resides within the student and it's the teacher's job to identify and respond to those difficulties, a contextual model admits that while a student may have a deficit, it also broadens the perspective. It looks at things like instructional practices. Are the instructional practices appropriate for the child or for the child's age or the child's circumstances? It looks at socioeconomic concerns. Are the students engaging in texts that are culturally relevant to them? It might also look at things like, does the child have access to breakfast? It allows for questions of learning style. It allows for concerns, for some outside concerns other than just the child's reading to be able to be part of the conversation as we come to address whether or not a student is having reading difficulties. Most contextual models really look at, many of them, and many of the ones that you're probably familiar with, really look at this idea of a child's development. And so we go back to the earlier conversation about people like Huey and the developmentalists of the 19th century. They really helped to inform some contextual models that really seek to understand how a child's performance might be contingent on their development. Several stage models of assessments have been developed. This one on the screen that you see right now is Jean Chall's model of reading stages. using something such as this would allow a teacher not only to identify what a student can't do, so what their deficit is, but perhaps what steps the students must develop in order to better perform the desired reading task. So I'm going to show you a couple of other stages models. This is the Spear, Swerling, and Steinberg's stage model that seeks to demonstrate the ongoing relationship between discrete skills such as phonemic awareness, word recognition, and strategic reading, such as like monitoring your own understanding, being able to summarize, things like that. And it demonstrates the skill gaps in the lower skills really begin to limit a student's ability to become highly proficient. The next stages that I'm going to show you was for spelling, and this is I'm only going to show, the bear has a 15-point spelling stage, but I think most of us would recognize whether or not it's just from our experience with young pre-literate or emergent reading children, or if it is from our own experiences as a teacher. We're kind of recognize these ideas of early stages of writing, of spelling. Another one that I wanted to show you for stages, well, I'm sorry, now I want to move on. So we have developmental stage, which kind of looks almost like a sequential idea. And then the cognition model believes that reading is really composed of 3 separate components, and that these components these aren't exclusive, like you can believe in a stages and a cognition at the same time. But really it's important to understand that cognition models, when we look at reading from a cognition approach, we really believe that reading is composed of three components. One would be the automatic recognition of words. 2 would be the comprehension of the language in the text. And then 3 would be the ability to use strategies to achieve one's purpose in text. So that would be being able to summarize, being able to monitor for your own understanding, those types of skills. So whether or not you believe in a cognitive model or a stages model, it really means that in today's framework, assessors have to consider why a reading problem is suspected, which includes a look at what is needed for a reading to occur, but also to look at other things that can cause reading problems, such as emotional issues or testing anxiety, life problems that might interfere with the testing. So it leads the assessor to consider a lot of things and to try to put together almost like clues to figure out what could be keeping a student from learning. So really what we want to think about then is that comprehension really kind of really is reliant on 3 things, which would be word recognition. So this is why things like, especially early on, this is why having reading inventories or listening, it helps students to be able to become familiar with words. And if an automatic word recognition seems problematic, you can start to look to see what's going on there. The next is the context, which means that a student needs to be able to predict the words in the passage, meaning that the student begins to use context clues to be able to draw understanding from the passage itself. And then lastly, the student needs to be able to monitor his or her own reading. And so they want to be able to rapidly select the right strategy. For instance, let's say they encounter a word that has multiple meanings. It is personal monitoring that allows students to decide how are they going to be able to figure out which meaning of the word is appropriate in this context. And this is really why we've moved to an understanding that texts that have no meaning are difficult for readers to decode. And so basal readers have moved into becoming more of leveled reading, and you'll see that there's much more of an attempt to create context for the learner in these when you compare them to some of the earlier basal readings programs that we had in the, when they were first introduced. Another thing that you want to, when you encounter students that are having reading difficulties, another really important piece to that puzzle when you go back to that idea of being a detective is this question of fluency and really digging into whether or not a child can read accurately and quickly enough. So these are things that there's a number of fluency, like Dibbles and a couple of others, that really begin to look to see whether or not a child is accurate, also whether or not a child is smooth. So does the child have to stop to sound out words excessively? Does the child have to repeat or self-correct excessively? Does the child seem to know most of the highly used or high frequency words? That is, that frees up, basically, if we think of it as a cognitive model, that frees up the student, the learner. It frees up their cognitive abilities. They're no longer attending to some of the decoding, and now they'll be able to develop some of the deeper skills. Really, really important is this idea of the Matthew effect, and it's really important as we are working with struggling learners that we remember that there's this problem with the Matthew effect. Once somebody becomes a struggling reader, they keep falling behind because they really begin to lack the practice. Sometimes it's because of choice. Sometimes it's because of choices that we make in the classroom where they are not given the same kind of practice as their differently abled peers. But the Matthew effect is something to keep in mind. And so really we want to think about whether or not our practices or interventions, once we've identified some possible reasons for struggling readers, we really want to begin to look at some ways that we can address the Matthew effect so that we're not sort of dumbing down our curriculum in a way that really kind of repeats this process. Okay, so what are some terms that we need to know? We need to know, and when we're talking about an assessment, and this will be for when you're posting on Blackboard or Leo or whatever it might be, we're going to need to make sure that you understand some basic differences. So a group versus an individual test is important. An individual test really is one that the child is taken one-on-one. An oral response is required. It allows for adaptive testing, meaning that as a student is getting a number of things, struggling with a number of things, you might move down the test level. If they're doing really well, you might move it up. Most of the reading assessments that are done with early readers are done on an individual. Group tests, then, obviously, are the ones that are conducted where the entire group is working on it. The next kind is the informal versus the formal. In an informal assessment, the teacher has wide latitude to interpret results and to develop and within the testing method itself, as opposed to a formal testing situation where it's very rigid. There's little discretion of the teacher. The teacher might be given a script. Exact time limits for each section of the test might be given. The next one is norm reference versus criterion reference. Norms look at how the child's performance is when you compare it to other students of their same age. These are reported in percentiles and grade in Stanines and grade equivalents, and so these are something that we look at in terms of many slows, look at those and stuff like that. Criterion and benchmark are more like For instance, when you took your driving test when you were 16, you only had to pass 75% of the questions in order to pass the exam. So that's really criterion or benchmark. You need to pass a certain amount to be able to be considered that you've passed the test. And so we see those as, as very different than the norm referenced tests. So when we think about norms, we've probably heard some of these: percentile rank, stay-nine, grade equivalent score, a normal curve equivalent, a scale score, or quartile. I would suggest to you that as a reading teacher or a teacher of reading, that you really want to become familiar with stay-nines. While stay-nines aren't as specific as percentiles, if you look at a stay-nine, there's 9 statistically comparable divisions of the population tested, with the 5th being in the middle of the normal curve and accounting for 20% of those were tested. So what that means, though, is that it means that it takes as much effort for a student to move from a first to a second stay-nine as it would for the student to move from like the 7th to the 8th stay-nine. So stay-nines are really, really useful for us to be able to, when we're looking at measuring improvement. Because it's really looking within the distributive curve, that becomes really important. Probably the least useful one for you to look at is the grade equivalent score. I know, like, when my students were in elementary school, they would take some kind of a test through their library, and they would bring home a sheet that would tell me that they were able to read at a 13.5 level or whatever it might be. That's most problematic, because let's take that and whatever that passage was that my 5th grader took or my 6th grader took when they brought me home this paper that made me think, oh wow, my children are so brilliant. The fact of the matter is that was probably very problematic, because it's quite unlikely that college level students actually read that passage and took those and read those questions. So it's kind of extrapolated and very inconsistent. Another really important idea to remember is reliability of a test. And what reliability hinges on is if I give that test over and over again, and am I going to continue to get consistent results? Obviously, that's without any interventions or changes in the student's instruction. If I gave them a test on Monday and then I gave them the same test on Wednesday, am I going to get the same result? That's reliability. The other thing that you want to think about is validity. And validity is important because what validity looks at is whether or not a test measures what it says it does. Does it reflect the taught curriculum? That sounds pretty simple, but actually it's not as easy when you think about some of the Common Core math problems and you see how much more verbal ability is required in some of those word problems. That's an example of, there's questions and concerns about the validity of the test. Is it measuring their ability, or is it measuring their reading comprehension, those types of things. Okay. So those are some of the terms that I want to make sure that we're using in the same way. So I hope that you were able to take notes. I will post the presentation itself on Leo so that you can click through it and go back to it if you'd like. I'll make sure to do that by the end of this week. But what I'd like you to know that this week at 11:55 I believe is how it's in the computer, on 8/26, please make sure that you have uploaded your personal inventory assignment to Leo, that you have gone into Leo and downloaded the National Reading Panel Report, A Practical Advice for Teachers, and that you've read that. Then I'd like you to log into the Leo forum and post a response to the prompting question that I have up there. Please then respond to your classmates' material. I know it might not be possible to respond to everybody's response, so at least 3 or 4 people if you could please. And then the other thing I'd like you to do is to download and read about the case study assignment, which is part of this class. If you have any questions about that, please make sure that you email me with any questions. But other than that, if you accomplish those tasks by 8:26, you are going to be in good shape. And I just want to thank you and hope to see you again here next week.